Good evening. It's such a pleasure to be with you this evening. First things first, yes, I am aware that there are lines in my head. No, they are not cornrows, as one girl at a church one time asked me. They are scalp ridges. I did an Ancestry.com search a few years back and discovered I am 1/8 Klingon. So I figure when I introduce myself, I better let people know, yes, I'm aware that my head looks funny, and so no one has to worry if there's something wrong or if I'm dying. I'm just me. But I can't tell you how excited I am to finally be here to meet you all and appreciate so much the encouragement that you have been in your financial help from my family and I. Raising support, and it's the first time I've done this, and it's a challenge, and so I'm thankful so much for your kindness and your love and the prayers that you offer as well, and taking an interest in the work that we're doing in Hancock County. Thank you so much. The gospel tells us about all sorts of different things from Jesus and his ministry. And one item of note that I have found very curious is that people are always searching for Jesus or looking for him in some capacity. And if you know anything about the Lord's work here on this earth, you know that people were oftentimes pressing to see him, to try to find him, to try to get something from him. And you would think that that would be a good thing. But that's not necessarily always the case. And I think that as we take a closer look at some of the examples from the life of Jesus and the things that he was searching, or that people were searching for from him, I think that we'll see some different types of motives that come up that I'd like for us to consider tonight. And I want to think with you about searching for Jesus and take a little closer look at this subject. The first thing that we can do is look at some of the instances of those who sought after Jesus. The first grouping that we've got, and this is not going to be an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination, but are these different just kind of groups of people, these masses, and that also included his family. So if you'll turn over to Mark chapter 1 with me, Mark chapter 1, we're going to notice at the very beginning of his ministry from Mark's perspective, starting in verse 32, Mark chapter 1, verse 32. The text tells us, at evening, when the sun had set, they brought to him all who were sick and those who were demon-possessed, and the whole city was gathered together at the door. Then he healed many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons, and he did not allow the demons to speak because they knew him. Now in the morning, having risen a long while before daylight, he went out and departed to a solitary place, and there he prayed. And Simon and those who were with him searched for him. And when they found him, they said to him, "Everyone is looking for you." But he said to them, "Let us go into the next towns, that I may preach there also, because for this purpose I have come forth." Word of Jesus, as I'm sure all of us are familiar with, spread like wildfire. What he was doing was incredible, was remarkable, and was unlike anything that they had seen. They even talked about how when he preached, that he preached with an authority that was simply unknown to them. And rightly so, because he is the sovereign authority of all creation. And as people took note of that, of course, they noticed his power as well. And as that was spreading, word comes to people, and people came to him. And so much, as the text tells us, this whole town gathers out at the door of where Jesus is meeting with folks. And these people are searching because of the miracles that he's doing. But Jesus cited that healing people, he says, this isn't what I'm here for. Not that it wasn't a part of his ministry, but it wasn't the focal point. He says it was to preach. I'm here to preach the gospel. As a side note, one of the things that I find very frustrating about some other places and other congregations that meet in this world is oftentimes when they go on what they will call a mission trip, or a preaching trip, there oftentimes is very little preaching going on and lots of social things and things that aren't bad in the sense of helping somebody to have some food or to even have a house built, but that's not the point of what the gospel is about. The gospel is about preaching, teaching God's word. But that's what Jesus said, that's what I'm here for. Notice another example from Matthew chapter 12, where we get some more clarification as to the motives, if you will, of those who are seeking Jesus, and he pretty much puts it in perspective for those who are there. Matthew chapter 12, verse 46, while he was still talking to the multitudes, behold, his mother and brothers stood outside, seeking to speak with him. And one said to him, look, your mother and your brothers are standing outside, seeking to speak with you. But he answered and said to the one who told him, who is my mother, and who are my brothers? And he stretched out his hand toward his disciples and said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. So you put this together with the other gospel accounts that we have, and we find that Jesus' family itself was searching for him, looking for him. But as we see from other places in John and Mark, they weren't seeking him out always on good terms. In fact, sometimes they sought him out because they felt like they had to rein him in because they thought he was crazy. His brothers are specifically cited in John 7 as saying that they didn't believe him, that they thought he needed to come back to his senses. And so we can see that even those that were in close proximity to him, when they sought him out, it wasn't always because something was good or because they had something positive to say. Sometimes it was, let's put him in a straitjacket and track him back home before he makes us look bad. Obviously not understanding his purpose and his point. They were searching for Jesus to try and knock some sense into him, so to speak. Well, a second group that we see of individuals who sought Jesus out are the Jews, the Pharisees. We'll just kind of put them all together. In John's gospel, John tends to refer to the Jews as referring to kind of the leadership of the people. And so over in John chapter 7 and verse 10, beginning, we see another instance of people seeking him out. John 7, verse 10 beginning, but when his brothers had gone up, then he also went to the feast, but not openly, but as it were in secret. The Jews sought him at that feast and said, where is he? And there was much complaining among the people concerning him. Some said, he is good. Others, no, on the contrary, he deceives the people. However, no one spoke openly of him for fear of the Jews. We can look at this group of ruling authorities in the time of Jesus, these individuals, and we know that they were in conflict with Jesus a lot, and they were searching for him here as well. But of course, why were they searching for him? It wasn't to pat him on the back and say, attaboy. It wasn't to say, hey, we want to hear more what you got. They were enemies. They saw what he did. They heard what he did. They didn't like it. And so their motives were not good in searching for him. And of course, throughout his entire ministry, folks sought after him. And it culminates in what we see in John chapter 18. Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane and at that betrayal. But there's something that I want to kind of note there that I think is interesting. John chapter 18, beginning with verse 1. And when Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron. And there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. And Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. Then Judas, having received a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward and said to them, whom are you seeking? And they answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus said to them, I am he. And Judas, who betrayed him, also stood with them. Now, when he said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. I want you to think about this. Just picture this for a moment. Jesus is with the disciples. They're in the garden, and this has always fascinated me. And you can kind of picture what's happening. This large detachment, this wasn't just a couple of guards, okay? There were probably a few dozen guys, if I understand correctly, maybe as much as 100 soldiers. A lot of fellas came with to arrest Jesus. But it's nighttime, it's late, and the garden is not just like the garden you've got at your house, which is a couple of rows of stuff. It's a decent-sized area with lots of trees and places, and apparently people who didn't have places to sleep would oftentimes even sleep in the garden, kind of next to, I guess there's some concrete walls and things like that, or whatever, rock faces. And so it was a place where people huddled. So there were individuals there. So these guys come up with their lanterns and their weapons and their torches, and I can just imagine the soldiers saying, hey, we're looking around, and Jesus says, well, who are you looking for? And they say, oh, we're looking for Jesus. Well, that's me. And they fall over. You know, the thing that strikes me about that is how much had they vilified Jesus, the Pharisees and the leadership, for those guys to react that way. You would think that they were searching for a man who was a notorious murderer and rapist, and someone who was had leprosy and pus coming from his eyeballs. I mean, this is somebody that is disgusting at every level you can think of. That's how they reacted. And that's not the Jesus that we know, but it's sure how people thought of him, at least the leadership. So what these guys thought they were looking for, these soldiers were searching for Jesus of Nazareth, but the guy that was next to him, apparently it never occurred to them that it could be him. Talk about searching for someone that you know nothing about, or what you've been led to believe was something different. I just find that interesting. There's not really a grandiose point from that other than it's amazing how people can look for one thing, and when they find it, they don't even recognize it, but that's maybe a discussion for another time. But anyways, this group of individuals looking for Jesus had come with prejudice and hostility. That was what their search was about. And then finally, another group of individuals is the Gentiles over in John chapter 12. John chapter 12, starting with verse 20. The text says, "Now there were certain Greeks among those who came up to worship at the feast. Then they came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida of Galilee, and asked him, saying, 'Sir, we wish to see Jesus.' After Jesus had been raised, the Pharisees and those who were enemies of Jesus openly acknowledged, we can't deny that he's been raising people from the dead, that he's been doing all these amazing things. We can't deny that, so much so that they thought the best way to deal with it was to kill both Jesus and Lazarus." Wow. Talk about guys who had their motives, were just strung out in general, really weren't seeing things very clearly. Let's take this wonderful event and let's try to erase it. Good guys don't do that sort of thing. But the Gentiles, a group of people that the Jews never thought much about, were interested in seeking Jesus out. And of course, this isn't the first time. We've got centurions and Canaanite woman and a Samaritan woman. We've got other Gentiles that were interested in Jesus, either seeking him out specifically or like the Samaritan woman, kind of figuring out, stumbling onto it and realizing, this man is special, come with me and let's talk more with him and see just how amazing he is. And so all of these different groups, and like I said, there's probably many more that we could consider this evening, but I just wanted to note that there's one group of people that we really haven't talked about yet, and that is the obvious one. It's the people sitting in the pews tonight, those who would seek to be his disciples. But that's kind of where the bulk of our thoughts are this evening. The reason we spent that time looking at these different instances is to kind of remind ourselves of all the different types of reasons that people may have for searching for Jesus, for looking for him. But our purpose tonight is to ask, I'm asking you, and you ask me, and we ask each other, why are we here? Why are we here tonight? Why are we here as a collective? You are a collective body here in Fishers. We have a collective body in Hancock County, and there might be others from other congregations here as well. Why are you searching for Jesus? What is your motive? This lesson always hits me between the eyes, no matter when I preach it, how often. I find it to be extremely challenging, and I hope you'll see some of that as we get into this. But I want us to consider that here this evening. Why do you seek Jesus? Because what should be obvious, the positive answers, as we've already seen, that's not always the case. In fact, there are more examples that I think may strike a little closer to home that I want us to consider here tonight. The first off is that sometimes people are searching for Jesus because they're just curious. The example I cite is from Luke chapter 23. Turn there, if you will, with me. Luke chapter 23. Luke 23, starting in verse 7. The sham of a trial that concerns Jesus continues. And this is speaking of Pilate. And as soon as he knew that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, that is Jesus, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. Now, when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he had desired for a long time to see him, because he'd heard many things about him, and he'd hoped to see some miracle done by him. And he questioned him with many words, but he answered him nothing. The chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him, and then Herod with his men of war treated him with contempt and mocked him and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. The Bible says that Herod was searching for Jesus. And apparently, ever since the death of John the Baptist, he'd heard things about Jesus, that maybe he was John the Baptist reincarnated. Of course, that meant something to Herod. Herod had him killed. And he hears of these wonderful miracles, and Herod wants to see him. But why does he want to see him? Well, the text tells us he wants him to perform. Dance, preacher man. That's basically what Herod wants. He wants to see him perform some miracle, to see some sign. And although I won't deny how wonderful that is and can be, that's the only thing that apparently interested him. It never seems to matter to Herod about any sort of examination of Jesus for guilt. That doesn't seem to be mentioned anywhere here. Almost like a man's life wasn't in the balance after all. Herod was seeking him because he was curious. He wanted to know something about this Jesus. Well, you're here today. Why do you seek Jesus? Are your motives somewhat like Herod's in that maybe you're just curious? Paul faced some of that same problems when he would stand before those in positions of leadership, and they would basically they'd be there to kind of see what this whole thing about the way was, these Christians, this Paul guy, and find out what it was about, but they really weren't all that interested in what he had to say. Guys like Felix and Festus, there's different groups Paul stood before. Paul faced the same thing. They were curious to a point, but that's about it. Yeah, sometimes people's motive for seeking Jesus is I'm just kind of curious. Maybe somebody's been badgering me about going to church or doing some Bible study with them, and okay, I'm kind of curious how they differ from so-and-so, and certainly that can be a door opening. The gospel can touch anyone, but a lot of times people's motives are just, I'm not really interested, I'm just curious. Well, obviously it's one thing to talk about someone being curious when they are new to the gospel, but it's another thing for someone to claim to be a Christian and to just be curious. That's not going to cut it, is it? That's not going to cut it at all. And certainly if that is what we are dealing with, we can't allow that to continue. Is the worship of Jesus just something for us to do? We just curious? Well, another motive that we might have, that people have for seeking Jesus, can be to discredit him. Over in Luke chapter 11, verses 53 and 54, and as he said these things to them, the scribes and Pharisees began to assail him vehemently and to cross-examine him about many things, lying in wait for him and seeking to catch him in something that he might say, that they might accuse him. These guys, we're told, they're lying in wait, but it's not to have a surprise party. Surprise! It's to catch him. They, of course, are thinking like carnal men that he's going to make some kind of mistake. Or really, they feel like he's already made a bunch of mistakes according to their interpretation of things. They just got to catch him doing something politically incorrect or controversial, right? So they're waiting. They're looking for a reason to catch him. Have you ever had that before? Someone at work or school or in your neighborhood knows that you're one of those goody two-shoe Christian folk, and they're watching because they're hoping to see you fail. Well, certainly that's something that these individuals, that the leadership in Jesus' day, many of whom were caught up in. But the thing that always gets me when I look at this is, why didn't they just leave him alone? If they hated him so much, why not just leave him alone? You know, it's a lot like with our atheist friends, if we have any. There are some people who are atheists who don't care that you're a Christian. That's fine with them. It doesn't affect them. If that's what you want to believe, they're okay with that. They're even willing to have a discussion, but they're not trying to do anything beyond that. Then there are the others like Richard Dawkins who are militant evangelicals in their atheism. They are not only rejecting Christianity, but they are looking to crush you and any other, from their perspective, any other moron who believes this superstitious stuff. And they're militant. And you say, why not just leave it alone? Well, I think we get an answer to that over in this text in Luke 16. Luke chapter 16, beginning with verse 13. Jesus says, no servant can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. Now the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, also heard all these things, and they derided him. And he said to them, you are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. For what is highly esteemed among men is an abomination in the sight of God. The answer is right there. The reason why people didn't just leave Jesus alone, and why those become militant in atheism want to crush you and disprove you, is because they need to justify themselves. That what they're doing is right. Now, I care about being correct. I care about being right and truth, and I'm sure you do too. That's why you're here. But have you ever had maybe a religious discussion with someone, and it became quickly apparent that somebody in this discussion wasn't interested in learning the truth, but just being right? Didn't matter if it was actually correct or not. They just needed to win the argument. Well, that's kind of what we're talking about here, except these guys, as long as Jesus of Nazareth was correct, they were not. And that didn't rub some folks the right way. They needed to disprove Jesus. They needed to draw into question the veracity of his words. They needed to make sure that people discounted him as a liar and a lunatic so that he could just be written off and they could happily go along their way believing they're right and everybody else believing they're right because they needed to justify themselves. Have you ever encountered that before? Maybe not just in religious settings and just in life in general. People who've got to justify themselves. Well, our culture is a culture of narcissists, so undoubtedly you have encountered that. If not, you will. But what about us? Why do we seek Jesus? Are we looking to discredit him? And we think, oh, of course not. But then when we put that in a more finite or a more specific, rather, connotation, that we're looking to justify ourselves, now we could be talking. Because men have always argued with God about what God actually wants. You ever had that before? Ever had somebody tell you that they knew what you really meant or what you really thought, and of course it was totally wrong? They just insisted that you know what's going on, or that they know what's going on, and you're thinking, what? I don't recall either one of us having telepathy here to be able to exchange information. There's some more Star Trek for you. How are you getting this? Well, I just know. This cat reads minds, apparently. That's something that is a serious issue if we encounter that, and if we are like that, if we are coming to the point where we're going to tell God why He's wrong about something so that we feel better, whoa. We got a problem, don't we? First of all, no one tells God He's wrong because He's never wrong. And second of all, if we're foolish enough to do that, we sound an awful lot like the devil when he first told Eve all those years ago, God's got it wrong. You're not going to die. We know who's speaking there. We know the force that is behind trying to discredit Jesus, because then we can justify ourselves and then we can feel better about the sin and the error that we're in, and then we don't have to change, and then we can feel good about ourselves. And after all, number one priority of life is to feel good, right? That's the number one thing for Americans. Feel good. Don't be displaced in any way. Only seeking the pleasurable things. Hey, man, I like those things. I enjoy things. I'm the kind of guy, without air conditioning, I turn into a very grumpy grizzly bear. Okay? I'm fat, and I'm fat. And so I like being cool, and it takes more to cool down this guy. That's why football weather was always so nice for me. But there are things that are nice, and there are things that we have to have at all costs. And those are the things that lead us to tell God He's wrong and why we're okay in what we're doing. Is that why you're here? Is that why you're seeking Jesus? Because you're looking to justify yourself? I don't know. I can't answer that. I hope not. But they're real motives that real people have had and do still have today, and we cannot afford to assume that our motives have nothing to do with that. We have to examine ourselves. Well, a third motive that we can have for seeking Jesus is simply to use Him. And before we get into this point, I think the first 2 points that we've looked at here, the idea of being just curious or looking to discredit Jesus, those both are slim to no chances that the people in this audience tonight have that. And you may struggle with that. There may be somebody who's not yet a Christian here who's still evaluating whether or not choosing Jesus is the right thing. But as a general rule, in an audience full of believers, baptized Christians, aren't just curious, and they're really not looking to discredit Jesus. They're looking to hold Him up and show His credibility. And then there's this point, that sometimes people seek Jesus to simply use Him. Over in John chapter 6, if you're not over there already, John chapter 6, beginning with verse 25. And when they found Him on the other side of the sea, they said to Him, Rabbi, when did you come here? And Jesus answered them and said, Most assuredly I say to you, you seek me, not because you saw the signs, but because you ate of the loaves and were filled. Do not labor for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to everlasting life, which the Son of Man will give you, because God the Father has set His seal on Him. Jesus called out the people in this text for seeking Him for selfish reasons. Now, I want to make something very clear up front. Seeking Jesus Christ is the absolute best thing you can do for yourself, no exceptions. The best thing you can do for yourself as an individual, as a created creature in God's image, is to unify yourself in that holy image through Jesus Christ. Best thing you can and will ever do. But we need to understand that this is not simply a one-way street. That we are not simply seeking after Jesus to use Him up. I like to use the illustration of a genie in a bottle. I'm not the first one to use it, but a lot of times people treat Christ that way. They pull the bottle off the shelf and rub it, and poof, There's God. Okay, Lord, I pray for this. I want this. I need this. Cram them back in, set it back on the shelf, and go about life like nothing happened. A lot of people in our country treat God that way, unfortunately. They're just using him. Think about it from an earthly perspective. If you have someone you love who is courting a man or a woman, and you realize that that person is all take and no give, what do you tell that loved one? Do you tell them, oh yeah, it'll be fine, it's great? You tell them, run for the hills, dude. Don't look back, because that person is all about themselves. They are all in it for themselves. They are only going to use you up. They're not going to think about you. They're not going to provide and take care. They're not going to share in that way. We know we look for those kind of things. Parents look for those kind of things for the significant others of their children. And when they see a child doing that, they 2x4 them upside the head and say, pay attention. This is unwise. Why? Because relationships are two-way streets, and should we think any less of the God of heaven, who is the ultimate relational character in the universe, that he is content with a one-way street, with only giving to us and never receiving? I don't think so. I don't think so. Yet so many people believe that's all God's looking for. He is the grandfather who only wants to spoil his kids with no expectation. And of course, grandparents aren't like that either. Grandparents expect affection. Even grandparents at some point in time realize when they're just being used and say, I'm not getting that kid a present anymore. The only thing they want from me is stuff, if they've got any common sense. I've met a few that haven't, unfortunately, but I digress. We understand that relationships are bilateral. They go both ways. And when someone seeks Jesus to just use him, these folks, they weren't searching for Jesus because of what he was offering relationally. They sought him because apparently they were looking for their next meal. Now, you may or may not have noticed, but I am a man who occasionally enjoys food. And I can appreciate getting a free meal, being well fed, but that's not what Jesus was about. He was about feeding the soul, about teaching them how to please God. And I want you to very seriously consider, is your relationship with Jesus, is it a one-way street? Is it something that's just about what he gives you and not about what you offer to him? And it's not that Jesus needs anything from you. He's your creator. He wants it from you. It's a lot like when you're putting up the Christmas tree. I've got 4 kids. I got a 10-year-old, a 7-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 2-year-old, which means that the level of brain damage my wife and I have suffered is monumental to this point in time. But one of the joys we have of kids is when your 2 or 3-year-old wants to help you decorate the Christmas tree. And they're all excited about that. Now, if we were going to take the more male perspective, which is, I can get this thing done in a half hour, get out of my way, right? Hopefully we recognize that's not good. We take the typical parent approach, hopefully, which is, of course, I can get this done faster without little fingers and putting them on the same 2 rows and the whole top part of the tree is left barren. We let them help us because we need it? No. But because we want them to want to help. We want that involvement. We want that demonstration of our relationship. God doesn't need our help spreading the gospel, but he absolutely wants it. God doesn't need our worship, but he absolutely wants it. And ultimately, we learn those things are about, they help us in the long run. So even the things that God wants ultimately help us anyways. That relationship cannot be one way. It's not a relationship. It's just 2 characters exchanging information at best. A relationship is always a 2-way street. We have to be careful about why we're seeking Jesus. Well, there's one more reason that we seek Jesus, and that's That's the best one. Are we seeking him because we want to love him? Over in John's gospel, toward the end, John chapter 20, we have what is a very tender and sad as well as powerful, all these emotions rolled into one with Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. John chapter 20, verse 1. Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb early, while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. Then she ran and came to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They've taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Jumping over to verse 11, the same chapter. But Mary stood outside by the tomb weeping. And as she wept, she stooped down and looked into the tomb. She saw two angels in white sitting, one at the head and the other at the feet, where the body of Jesus had lain. Then they said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" And she said to them, "Because they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they've laid him." Now when she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" And she, supposing him to be the gardener, said to him, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him, "Rabboni," which is to say, teacher. And Jesus said to her, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. But go to my brethren and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." A question that needs to be asked is, why did Mary go to the tomb? What was in it for her? Well, why does anyone visit a gravesite? Her and the disciples, they weren't anticipating his resurrection. They should have been, but they weren't. They were still catching up. And so she wasn't there because she was waiting for him to come out of the tomb. She was there to help prepare his body, to honor him. Why does anybody go to a gravesite? It's not because we believe that there is something left for them to still give us. We're there simply because we love them. That's our motive. And that was Mary's. It was pure. It was unselfish in the sense of she was not there because there was one more miracle for Jesus to do for her. There actually was. She didn't know that, though. Praise God that there was. But she was there because she loved him. That's the kind of seeking of Jesus. And you notice, you saw what he said. He said, "Why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" Jesus knew what she was there. She was there to see him, but she was so grief-stricken because the person who she loved the most in this entire world, the person who changed her life in more ways than she was yet to learn, that meant everything to her, he was gone. And she was there to express whatever love she could still express, even though he was not there anymore, so she thought. In our relationship with Christ, we recognize that there is nothing that we are going to give him that he is in need of. But I hope that we recognize that he is intensely desirous of our love and our attention and our zealous works, good works that he has commissioned for us to walk in, Ephesians 2:10. That we are remade in the image of Christ because we're supposed to be people doing those good things. And when we do those good things, we're doing them because they please the one we love. Why are you seeking Jesus? That is what we need to consider. This is the reason. Because we love him and we want to be close to him. One great mistake that we oftentimes as human beings fall into is that we end up loving the gift more than the giver. And my brethren, may that never be. I fall prey to that at times where I appreciate this gift so much, and should it be lost, it somehow taints the giver in my mind, and that is backwards. The giver is the source of love. The gift is an expression of it. It is a powerful example of it. But he's the one I love. He's the one you love. He's the one that we're seeking to please. And it's about him. We have to never fall prey to the religious error that is that being a Christian is about us. It's not. It's about Him. It always has been. Being a human being is about God, but most especially being a reborn child of light is about Him. And there's a lot of people in this world who have a serious problem with that. They feel like God is egocentric because he wants all this attention and all this stuff. No, that's what we were made for. He made us for that purpose. Why is it so strange that God, who created us to love Him, wants us to, wait for it, love Him? This, like I said, for me, this is very challenging because at times my motives are less than pure. At times my motives are selfish in seeking Jesus, and I treat Him more like He's there for me than I'm here for Him. And as we think about these things here this evening, I just want to leave you with the question again, why are you here? Why are you searching for Jesus? What is it that you want from Him? If it's not that last point, to love Him, then our motives are wrong. Our motives can be reframed, worked on. Our paradigm can shift by the grace of God, but we've got to understand that we have to love Him for His sake. Because that's what love does. That's what a relationship is all about. Are you searching for Jesus tonight because you want to love Him? If that is the case, are you ready tonight to own that relationship that He's offering to you? Please, I beg you, don't leave His love unrequited. Unrequited love is always a sad, miserable thing, but it's a whole lot worse for us when we leave God's love unrequited. Don't do that. If, as a Christian tonight, you recognize that maybe your motives haven't been as pure as they ought to be, maybe they've been a little selfish in regards to why you're searching for Jesus, it's not too late to repent of that. God would love to have that heart that says, Lord, I haven't done it like I should, but I want to take a step further today in saying, I want to seek Jesus for Jesus' sake. You can do that now. If there's some aspect of your life that is amiss, there's something that needs to be put back in place so that you can seek Jesus with the right heart and with the right attitude, then we stand ready to assist you tonight. If you're subject to the call of the gospel, please come as we stand and sing.